Okay, hello. I'm supposed to start now. We're 3 minutes late, so I apologize. Welcome. Hi, my name is Greg Lauer, and I'm honored to be the president of the Jefferson Humanists. The Jefferson Humanists are a local chapter of the American Humanist Association. Our mission is to expand an ethical and life-affirming community devoted to science, reason, inclusion, and social responsibility. Our vision is free thinkers building a better community. And so to live into our mission and vision, we are excited to sponsor this evening's presentation, Healing the World Through Secular Humanism by Phil Zuckerman. We're hosting the event with the Secular Hub, which is also a local chapter of the American Humanist Association. Please visit the information tables outside in the lobby area to learn more about our chapters, ask questions, and you can also visit our websites for additional information. I would like to thank several volunteers because without their work, this evening wouldn't have been possible. Jim Bowl, raise your hand, Jim. Lindy Bear, Bob Hoffman, Shanna Rubio, and Matthew Elijah. So we want to thank them very much. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's presentation and find it insightful and inspiring. Please plan on staying for conversation, snacks, drinks at the reception afterwards. I've been told, make sure you turn these off so we don't interrupt the speaker. And I'd like to bring up Barb Sandoval. She's the chair of the Secular Hub. She's going to share a few minutes of information. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Greg.
You bet.
Hi, everybody. Some years ago, Seth Andrews was in town to speak at a conference, and he spoke about community, the need for community, and that the need for community is a human need and not specifically a religious one. So religious people often have community through their church or other religious organization, but secular people need to look usually for a different option if they don't feel at home in a church. So the Secular Hub is an organization that was founded to build secular community. One of the key features of the Secular Hub is that we have a physical location. That was one of the core organizing principles of the whole thing. So that's a key thing. And we use our physical location to fulfill two objectives in our mission. The first one is to build community through a series of activities, things that we do for educational events, social events, community service events. And this allows people to build friendships, have fun, and support each other through difficult times. The second part of our mission involves our relationships with other secular groups and providing our space to them in order to better collaborate with other secular groups and hopefully build and make stronger the secular community as a whole. So those are kind of our two objectives there. If you want to hear more about the Secular Hub, we've got a table out there, or feel free to join us for one of our events. Tomorrow morning we have Coffee and Community. Every Sunday morning we have Coffee and Community. It's a chance to get together, have coffee, talk to people, and it's kind of the coffee hour without the sermon. So, all right. And I'll turn it back to Greg now. Thanks.
Thanks, Barb, and take advantage of looking at both of our websites, the Jefferson Humanists or the Secular Hub, for additional information. I would like to introduce Lindy Bear now. Lindy will be introducing our speaker in just about 45 seconds, but I just wanted to say a few things about Lindy. He, with his wife, Robin, were founding members of the Jefferson Humanists back in 2014. In addition to being a founding member, he was head of the program committee for a number of years in a variety of other different leadership positions. And he was also involved in making this event happen. So without further ado, Lindy.
put my extra legs up here. Can you hear me all right? All right. So good evening. What a great and ready for action group. We have invited Dr. Phil Zuckerman to give us thoughts about the healing power of secular humanism. Dr. Zuckerman comes to us as Associate Dean and Professor of Sociology and Secular Studies from Pitzer College. Pitzer College is a member of the Claremont Colleges in Claremont, California. Dr. Zuckerman founded the first secular studies department in the nation. The Secular Studies Department provides an interdisciplinary program that focuses on aspects of secularity in societies and cultures, past and present, and includes the study of non-religious people, groups, thought, and cultural expression. Dr. Zuckerman is the author or co-author of 13 books, one of them being Living the Secular Life. This is my prop. And besides the secular life, he's published The Non-Religious and What It Means to Be Moral. His newest book will be out next month, Beyond Doubt, The Secularization of Society. Following Dr. Zuckerman's presentation, there will be some time for questions from the audience, so get your questions ready. And finally, you will be able to talk to Dr. Zuckerman in the reception that follows. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Phil Zuckerman.
Thank you, Lindy, my fellow duck, and thanks to Jim as well. And thank you for coming on this Saturday night in the middle of April. I love it. I love Colorado. It's, I think, my second favorite state probably after Oregon. And it's good to be back. I was at the Secular Hub last summer. And so I was happy to be invited back. So thank you. Good to see you all. So tonight what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to give a positive, inspiring talk that touts the benefits of secular humanist values. And so I hope there's some good feeling and inspiration from it. And I thought I would approach it based on, we had some really good planning for this, by the way. You got the Jefferson County folks here are the best planners I've ever, we had Zoom meetings, itineraries, so thank you. And so this was a bit of a team effort. So I'm going to do it kind of at three levels. We'll start at the individual level, go to the kind of societal level, and then we'll get to the global level at the end. So that's my preview of coming attractions. So to start at the individual level, I was like, well, I'll start with an individual. And I thought about a lot of the people that a lot of my work is just interviewing non-religious people, secular people, atheists, agnostics, humanists, nuns, N-O-N-E-S's, about their experiences, their upbringing, their challenges, their outlook, their values, their morals, and you hear great stories. I love doing in-depth interviews. It's one of the joys of the job. Currently, I'm interviewing Estonians via Zoom, and it's fantastic. We can get into that for a new project. So I thought about an inspiring person that I've come across, and I decided to land on Amber, who I now realize I also profile in the prop book that that Lindy held up. So if you read that, you'll recognize this. If not, let me tell you a little bit about Amber, because I think her story, her outlook, and some of the values she lives by are really indicative of some of the best that secular humanism has to offer. So we'll start with Amber. Amber was living in Seattle as a young woman. She actually grew up in Utah, grew up in a Mormon home, lost her faith in high school. That's a whole other story how that happened, but nothing too dramatic. It was just a series of doubts and questions over a couple years, and realized she didn't believe in it and it wasn't for her. But at this point in the story, she's living in Seattle. She was working at a great bookstore. She had a great moped. She had a great life. She was about 22, 23. And one evening, she was out with friends, and then it was time to head home, and she was on her moped at a red light, just waiting for it to turn green at 2 in the morning, when a drunk driver plowed into her from behind and severed her spinal cord from the sternum down. I believe it's called a T6 complete spinal cord injury, which meant she was permanently paralyzed and numb, so there's no feeling from her mid-sternum down. Young woman, prime of life, future ahead of her, intelligent woman, attractive woman, everything enjoying a great job, great opportunities, friends and whatnot, and this tragedy happens. And so we talked at length about that tragedy and how she dealt, how she coped, how she got through it. And of course, she couldn't rely on, she wasn't religious, she wasn't a believer. And those of you in the room who are non-believers, it's not like a choice. You can't just suddenly decide, okay, I guess I'll believe. Like, you just don't believe it, right? I've had so many religious folks say to me, like, well, have you ever tried to believe? It's like, I always say to them, okay, I do this little thought experiment. I'm like, if you just believed that, penguins could float in pineapple pudding for 15 minutes above the earth and speaking a different language, and they do this every night at midnight, if you could just believe that, it would cure cancer. Go. Can you believe it? Like, you can't force yourself to believe anything. So even in these trying times, like such an accident, she, of course, didn't believe in God. She didn't believe there was a healing higher power. And she also didn't have that communal support. So how did it work? Depression hit her hard. Suicidality was ever present. She got through it mostly through the love and commitment of her mom, who was just there for her from the beginning, right? Helping her get through that first year. Her mom was key. Friends were key. Family members were key. So she had that social support. Didn't turn to God, no prayers and whatnot. And what she said, though, at the end of the day was she had to look towards herself. And that's not so easy. We can't all do it. It's not, I don't tell everybody, you just rely on yourself. That's not always going to work. But for Amber, that's where she had to turn. And I'll just quote from her. She says, you focus, in terms of rehabilitating, deciding to live with this difficult injury, she said, you focus on what you can control. I'm quoting here. She said, so you have to really think about what you can control. What can I actually do? Literally. It takes thought. It's not just something that you can give over to God, let go and let God, or give over to someone else or some higher power. You can't just be like, oh, everything will work out. Because you physically have to make it work out. You do. I had to actively decide to live, to want to live. I had to make that choice. And then I had to do what needed to be done. When I fall out of my wheelchair and am laying on the ground alone, God isn't going to lift me up. I have to lift up myself. I have to figure out how to crawl to the corner of the room, find some leverage between the wall and the bed, and get back up again. It wasn't easy. It took me half a year to be able to figure out how to do that. What this illustrates to me is good old self-reliance. It's one of the tried and true values of, of the American spirit, but it's also a distinct secular humanistic value. Now, self-reliance, as I understand it, as most secular people understand it, doesn't mean going it alone necessarily. It doesn't mean just rugged individualism. Rather, it means having an orientation to life that is consciously self-determined within a context of natural reality. And if that means what resources can I draw on? What friends, what family, what support? Great. But it's a life stance that affirms that there are no lucky charms, no magical spells, no hovering ancestors, no haunting spirits, or auspicious tarot cards, or mystical guides, or benevolent gods, or sanguine goddesses that are going to help us. There's just this world, this life, and you have to do your own navigating. As humanist author Zora Neale Hurston said of her secular self-reliance, rather than pray to something utterly incomprehensible and non-existent, I accept the means at my disposal for working out my own destiny. Love that quote. And you might think, right, the Lord helps those that help themselves, or God helps him who helps himself. That quote's not in the Bible. It's not in the scriptures of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Zoroastrianism. It's not a religious adage. It comes from the pagan philosophers of ancient Greece and playwrights. And they knew explicitly that your ability to prove your own life is fundamentally and primarily in your own heart and mind and hands. So it's no accident that the man who wrote sort of the most famous work on self-reliance, anybody remember? Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's no mistake that he was a radical religious dissenter who rejected traditional theology, didn't believe in the supernatural claims of Christianity, and was castigated by his adversaries as an atheist. In the 1840s, he published the famous essay, Self-Reliance. Believe in yourself, for there's no ultimate authority other than that. As Emerson declared, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. And furthermore, nothing can bring you peace but yourself. And those are powerful sentiments. They can inspire courage, resilience, keep yourself grounded, and, as I said, it's a particularly secular value. Let me give you an example of that. Some of my favorite studies are social psychologists will ask parents, what kind of values do you want to cultivate in your children, right? And it's kind of a neat way to get people to think about these things. If you ask people directly, what are the values, you try to live by, it's not always so easy. Or you tend to go to the cliche, like, I try to be a good person or whatnot. Great. But when you ask them about what do you want to cultivate in your children, it sort of focuses the mind in a different way. And in a lot of these studies, they'll provide options, 30 different options. What kind of traits would you like to cultivate in your children? Creativity, intelligence, honesty, patriotism, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the interesting thing. The more religious the parent, the more the option obedience to authority goes to the top of the list of traits they want to see exhibited in their children. And the more secular the parent, the more atheistic, agnostic, humanistic, the number one option is think for yourself. And it's literally it's just, it's so interesting to me. Thinking for themselves is over and over again the value that secular parents want to cultivate in their children. And you know what? That's an excellent value for democracy. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself to the social. Obedience to authority is a great character trait for authoritarianism. Other key secular values from Amber's story, in addition to that self-reliance. And again, I understand we can't always go it alone. We need to rely on others, but relying on others in a thoughtful, deliberate way is part of self-reliance, understanding what's there and what help you need and how to access it and how to get help. But another aspect of Amber's story, another value of secular humanism is living in reality. And I remember when my wife and I were young and we were moving, I had been in Oregon for a while, now she was going to join me. Yay, 2 years of courtship finally paid off. And we had to move all her stuff up to Eugene from LA, and we had a small old trailer that someone had given us that was on the back of the car, and the tires kept popping on our way up to I-5. We had overloaded we had put all the heavy stuff in the trailer. We should have put the heavy stuff in the car and the pillowcases and it was miserable. And I remember just thinking, no, it's the laws of physics. Like, nothing's going to stop you. This is going to happen. These tires are going to keep popping. You got to figure it out. Nothing miraculous is going to save you. And that is key in Amber's story as well. She had to figure out how she was going to live her life herself. And another secular value that you see here is that here and nowness, which I think is such a wonderful value of humanism. We are not living, to a lot of religious folks, this is just a little like backstage before the grand show, right? That's really meaningful. But for us secular folks, this is it. We live in the here and now. We're not waiting for some golden beyond pie in the sky in the by and by. And that spurs a certain kind of orientation to the world, a certain kind of orientation to each other, a certain kind of orientation to politics, a certain kind of orientation to effective problem solving that I think is illustrative in Amber's story. So if you think about self-reliance, living in the here and now, pragmatic problem solving, living in reality, we can now move up into the societal level and see how these secular values play out at a much larger level, at the societal level. Here comes some fun sociology. And that's not an oxymoron, I promise. I want to share with you some of my favorite studies. I don't know if you've ever taken a soc class, but a lot of sociology is just complaining about how messed up things are. How bad poverty is, how awful racism is, how difficult and problematic sexism is, and this and so on, and crime and whatever it is. But there's also some really good news from sociology, and it's also secular good news, and I'm going to explain why. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite studies. Upstate New York. Here's what the investigators theorized. And they were thinking about crime, actually, how to solve crime. Talk about a societal problem. If you ask people what societal problems would they like to address, that's usually at the top of the list. And they thought about what might cause crime. What might cause crime rates to go up, to go down. And they had some interesting insights, but they wanted to test them. So here's what they did. First, they thought, I think there's something about poverty here at play. There's something about families living in unsupported circumstances. There's something about living in a precarious state that might be conducive towards future criminality. So what did they do? They thought, who's vulnerable in this population? Young, poor, pregnant women who are single. That's pretty vulnerable. They don't have a secure source of income. They may not have as much family support. They don't have a spouse. They're young. They're uneducated. They don't have a professional training, and they're about to give birth. And they divided these women into two groups, hundreds of them, a control group and an experimental group. In other words, one group that they didn't do anything to, they just observed them and watched them and gathered information over a time period. But here's what they did for the experimental group. They contacted these women and they said, you're pregnant and so on and so forth. We're going to provide for you a nurse who's going to come and visit you every other week for the last trimester of your pregnancy. A nurse can come to your house. Ask how you're doing. Ask how you're feeling. Answer any questions you might have. And then after you give birth, this nurse is going to continue to visit you every other week for the first 6 months, and then every third week for another 6 months, and then once a month for 2 years. For free, a nurse to visit you at home. Ask you how you're doing, ask you what you need, talk to you about any questions you have about nutrition, breastfeeding, child rearing, immunizations, whatever it is, here for you. And they watched what happened. The results. Compared to those in the control group that didn't receive these nurse visits, the single moms who received the nurse visits were far less likely to become pregnant again, much more likely to be gainfully employed, and much less likely to abuse or neglect their children. And over a decade later, the children from this study, those whose moms had received the nursing visits, were far less likely to be using alcohol or drugs, and most importantly, were far less likely, almost half less likely, to have ever been arrested. Simple nurse visits cut the crime rate by 50%. And it's cost effective, you know. To your Republican aunt or uncle, you can simply say, oh, you don't want to pay for nurses to make these visits? Well, you're going to be paying a lot more for the legal costs and the incarceration costs and the parole costs. But beyond the economic, you know, I don't even know if Republicans care about economics anymore. Maybe that was a long time ago. Now I think they just want AR-15s or something. But you know, the old Republicans that used to care about economic efficiency, you could, even if you don't want to go that route, just the moral level of supporting vulnerable people and the result that has for the society. There are so many studies like that. The Quantum Program study, researchers identified at-risk minority poor teenagers in rough neighborhoods in Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Texas. What did they do here? They had a control group and an experimental group. And the ones in the experimental group for 4 years, they were part of a group with an adult instructor. They received help with school, job training, community enrichment, and engagement. They took trips to the theater. They were given a monetary stipend that they could either spend or save for college. 2 years after the program ended, 50% fewer of them were had been subject to any kind of criminal arrest or engagement. So many more. South Carolina Family and Neighborhood Services, a large sample of teens who had already committed violent crimes. So these are the ones you're already, okay, these are teenagers, they've already committed violent crimes. 2 groups. One received the traditional punishments and threats of you're going to have a longer prison sentence and so on and so others. But the experimental group met with social workers several times a week who gave them therapy, worked with their families, addressed health issues, and helped them navigate difficult family situations. And again, the following years, those who participated in the program were half as likely to have been arrested as those who had not. We see studies like this and experiments like this all over the country and all over the world. So what do we see here? Social problems like crime can be addressed and ameliorated through sound, data-driven, secular solutions. Magical solutions don't solve societal ills. Mass shootings and school shootings will not be solved through prayer. They will be solved through human, secular solutions, sane policies, and sound legislation. So this leads to the next key secular humanist value, which you see time and time again, empiricism. We like data. We're the least likely to say, I think it's true because I feel it in my gut. We may have those feelings, but we don't rely on them to the degree that our fellow citizens do. We understand human bias, we understand fallibility, and we understand that data, falsifiable data that doesn't just confirm what we want it to say and how we think about the world is where it's at. Secular value of empiricism is an emphasis on evidence-based action, data-driven solutions. And we see this again and again and again. But none of that matters without the core secular values of empathy and compassion. The number one question I get, it's interesting. I feel like God's job has changed over the centuries, like his job description or his tasks, you know. I think there was a time when he was there to explain the aurora borealis. Like, how else do you explain that, you know? How do you explain a rainbow? Well, it's got to be God. I mean, look at that thing. And then we figured out how light refracts through water and mist, and we understood what a rainbow is, and that got, you know, God just had to cross that one off his duties, you know. We understood what caused earthquakes and thunder, and more and more and more and more of the natural world became explicable and understandable. But what is still sort of on God's to-do list is, it must be morality. Like that, whenever I'm talking to religious folks, be they family members or students or colleagues, and they never say to me like, well, what causes the rainbow if not God? They just don't, that's not in their back pocket. But what they will say is, well, but what about morality? I mean, where does morality come from if there's no God, right? What is your morality based on, if not following rules of an invisible deity? And, you know, and at the end of the day, it's empathy and compassion. That's really what secular morality tends to boil down to. understanding or feeling even the suffering of others as a bad thing. Knowing what it's like to be lied to, and that's not a good thing. Knowing what it's like to be the victim of a crime. Knowing what it's like to be cheated. Knowing what it's like to be a hit and run. Like, we understand what suffering is. We don't like it in ourselves. We feel bad when others are suffering as well. And those guide, so all that when I talk about empiricism and evidence-based action and data-driven solution, to what end? To human flourishing, to the alleviation of suffering. That's what we're trying to do here. And so empathy and compassion and that desire to alleviate unwanted suffering really is the crux of the moral matter. And what do we find today? I was here in Colorado. I arrived this morning. It was beautiful. And my best friend from University of Oregon, my college roommate, Kent Harvey, picked me up at the airport. And he said, hey, I got to pick up my daughter. Is it okay if she joins us? I said, great. Picked up his 15-year-old daughter, and we went to have breakfast in Denver. And within 5 or 10 minutes, I get to hear of the shooting at her school that just transpired. I assume you know about it. Young man shot 2 deans, and so on and so forth. So there's 2 things that struck me. Number 1, the sadness and tragedy of that event. And number 2, how mundane it was. It was just another school shooting. And we compared notes. You know, my kids, 2 have already gone through high school, 1 is still there. And we talked about how many emails we get. You know, oh, there's been a threat at school. When my son was taking an architecture program at the University of Colorado, Denver last summer, the last day was shut down because there was a threat of a shooting, right? It's just become so normal in our society. So if we think about the leading moral concerns of our society today, I would think gun violence might be up there. I would think, well, I'm going to go through it. And what I'm here to say is, when you look at these questions of morality, of suffering, of human flourishing, on every single one I can think of, and you can challenge me, the more secular the American, the more likely they are to want to alleviate and end suffering through sane solutions. And the more religious they are, it's just a correlation, not making any accusations here, but the more religious they are, the less likely they are to take the empathetic, compassionate position on addressing these moral questions. So let's start with guns. As you know, the United States has among the highest death by gun rates in the world. It's the #1 killer of our kids now. Surely the safety and well-being of others is at the top of any list of human flourishing and alleviating suffering, and is a moral issue. And on the studies we have, the more secular, the more atheistic, agnostic, and humanistic the responder is, the more likely they are to support sane gun legislation, right? Whether it be background checks, whether it be taking off the assault rifles from off our streets, et cetera, and the more religious, interestingly enough, the more church-going, Bible-believing, praying God, the more likely they are to want a proliferation of guns, a proliferation, a festival of AR-15s, an AR-15 in every third grader's locker, right, or holster. Immigrants and refugees. Talk about an issue of suffering, morality, and ethics. People fleeing warfare, people fleeing persecution, people fleeing slaughter. And on this matter, you know, despite how many plays they've gone to where there's a scene where someone says, no room at the inn, no room at the inn, the correlation still stands, that secular humanist correlation. The more secular among us are far and away the more likely to support legal amnesty and help for immigrants and refugees. And the more religious among us, and we can talk about why this might be the case, are the most supportive of draconian punishments, kicking them out, separating families, and not allowing them in. The death penalty. Talk about a matter of both mercy and justice. Secular humanists are much more likely to support the abolition of the death penalty, as every other democracy has done. And the more religious, despite what happened to their own prophet, are the most in favor of the death penalty. Racial justice. If there's any original sin competing with the genocide of Native Americans, it would certainly be our treatment of those of African ancestry. And here again, in every measure you can add, whether it's talking about, in any measure you can find, the more empathetic and compassionate among the whites surveyed, the more agnostic and atheistic are the most supportive of efforts to address racial injustice, repair racial injustice, and support movements for racial and civil rights, and the more religious are the least likely. And we see the same correlations for women's equality, homosexual rights, transgender rights, animal rights, death with dignity, even providing health care, universal health care, regardless of ability to pay yet again. So, and we were talking about this earlier, it's not as though secular humanists are kind of, okay, maybe they take this position on one moral issue, but they're over here on this moral issue. It is consistent on any moral challenge facing us today. Atheists, agnostics, humanists, and other secular folks take the most moral and compassionate position, and the more religious and the most religious take the least. And of course, there's a lot of folks in the middle. There's a lot of good, liberal, progressive, religious folks. They probably congregate here on Sundays. Gotta love the UUs. And there's liberal Jews, and there's liberal Catholics, and there's a whole swath of kind of whose politics are more in the middle or even lean left. But that's no accident. They're more secular in their orientation. They don't take the Bible literally. They take it as metaphorical or poetry. In other words, the more secular they are in their own religiosity, the more they tend away from these uncompassionate, I don't know what the opposite of compassion, harsh positions. And then what do we see? When it comes to empathy and compassion and justice and the alleviation of suffering enacted at the societal level, we can see it most successful in those democracies today that are the least religious. Now, I understand these all could just be correlations. That this could all, correlation is not causation, and maybe I'm just spinning my wheels and it's all a result of celery or something. But when you see these kinds of correlations, we can talk about it. Free education. Well, it's actually not free. It's sane taxation that provides education for all. And I mean all the way through. I've lived in Denmark for 2 years. Medical school. It's not just free. Your rent is paid for while you're in medical school, law school. All education from K through PhD and beyond is tax subsidized. Health care, affordable housing, affordable child care, elder care, extensive social services enacted in Scandinavia, which has among the lowest rates of church attendance in the Christian world, among the lowest rates of belief in God, among the lowest rates of belief in Jesus. I mean, they do believe in Jesus in this sense when I would talk to them. Oh, he was a nice man. That was the extent. He said some nice things. Like, right, but he was the Son of God? And they were like, nobody believes that anymore. This last time I was in Denmark was in December, and I was staying with my friends Lars and Kirsten. They're in their 50s, professionals. Their 2 daughters are out of the house now. And this really struck me, this difference, this constant, even though I've lived in Denmark for 2 years and I go there all the time to do my research, it still never ceases to amaze me, the distinctions between an American societal approach to these things and a Danish approach. So let me give you an example. Lars and Kirsten were telling me, well, what's new? We were sitting, they said, well, we've volunteered to be part of this new program. I don't know what you call it in the United States. We'll be afternoon parents. Afternoon parents. What is an afternoon parent? They said, well, what we have in Denmark is this system that's been developed over many years where if a parent or parents, if they have kids at home under the age of 16 or whatnot, and they're going through a hard time, maybe a divorce, maybe alcoholism, maybe one of them has cancer, maybe they are dealing with an emotional crisis, maybe there's stuff happening at work, but they're having a hard time. Other parents can volunteer to take care of their children just from after school till after dinner, and then they go home. So we pick them up from school, or they come over after school, they're here, we help them, they do their homework, we give them a snack, go for a walk at the beach, whatever. A nice, quiet place where they can just be while their parents are dealing with some heavy stuff. So that the parents can focus on what they need to focus, the children aren't feeling neglected or aren't in a bad environment or a stressful or doesn't right, and they do this for however long, 6 months, a couple years, whatever the situation requires, and we take them home. We're not foster parents, we're just there to give them a quiet, safe, supportive environment 5 days a week after school. And I was like, wow, that's amazing, that's amazing. And they said, yeah, and we've been going to the weekend trainings. We have to go to like 5 weekend trainings. We had to be vetted, get references, and then we have these intense trainings on how to do this. And they were telling me about the trainings, and I'm listening, and the role playing, and the self-examinations, and all this intense stuff. And I stopped and I said, so there's all these other parents in this training with you? Yes. From all over Denmark? Yes. How often does God come up? And they looked at me as if I had said, like, how often does blue cheese emerge? I mean, they just said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're all volunteering to do this charitable, altruistic work. How often is Jesus and God being raised in these seminars? And they said, never. What does that have to do with anything? Why would we talk about that? We're just here to do some good in our society, to help some kids in need and to support some families. What does that have to do with God or Christianity? And I said, in the United States, you tell me if this is your experience, any group like that would be faith-based, almost. I don't want to say every, but it would be such a core part, which is great. Hey, if Christians and Jews and Muslims want to do that kind of work, bless them, amen. But I just saw that distinction. And so we see that across the board. The most, in my new book that's coming out that was mentioned, me and my co-authors did extensive analysis, the best available data on countries, over 180 countries. And we found the 7 democracies today, there's 7, doesn't sound like a lot out of 200 and something countries, but I was impressed. And I'm only talking about democracies because dictatorships, I don't care. Atheist dictatorships are awful. Religious dictatorships are awful. I just care about societies where it's government by the consent of the governed. We now have 7 democracies today where the majority of people don't believe in God. Can I get a huzzah? Okay, so that is today Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Estonia, Czech Republic, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. This is remarkable. The UK was the sort of seat of Christendom for much of Western history, right? And so now we have these societies, most in Europe, but not all, where a majority of people don't believe in God. And what do we see in these countries? Among the lowest violent crime rates in the world. The best elder care in the world, best child care, best health care, best accessibility and disability rights. But on top of that, prosperity. On top of that, peacefulness, democracy. Are these because they've stopped believing in God? I can't make that extremist claim. I can't say that's just because of that, but I do think it has helped. It's part of the ingredient. It's one of the ingredients. It helps because secularism is much more conducive to democracy. Whenever I hear people say to me, we're a Judeo-Christian nation, we're founded on Christian principles, I'm like, there's no democracy in the Bible, folks. It's not mentioned. There's no word for it. Not in ancient Hebrew, not in ancient Greek, not in street Greek. Democracy is not biblical. It's Christ Jesus, King Jesus, and it's the Lord. It is all about obeying. In fact, one of the very first parables is, even if you're instructed to kill your own child, you obey. That's what it means to have biblical morality, right, in the story of Abraham. But I won't go there, sorry. I don't mean to use the pulpit for such blasphemy. But the point here is that when it comes to democracy, secularism is highly correlated. Women's rights, I've already mentioned trans rights, and race-based rights, and empirically based ways to alleviate suffering. And among the highly secular nations out there, what else we also see? They're the greenest. These are the nations, and this is now the final thank you. It's been a long journey. We're out that global level. And when I thought of global, I really only thought the biggie was global warming, climate crisis, right? What could be more global? We're all on this spinning ball together, and when it melts, it melts. Some of us are going to suffer more than others, obviously. Certainly the wealthy nations will fare better than the poor nations, as always is the case, but still it's all our home, one home. So let's go global. When it comes to the increasing impending climate catastrophe, yet again, what do we find? Strong theists, strong God believers and church attenders are the least likely to believe it's happening, to accept the science behind it, and to support policies and laws and implementations to address it. And atheists and agnostics and secular humanists are the most likely to understand the science behind the climate crisis, accept that we need to solve it, and are most in favor of policies, legislation, and any kind of implementation that will try and stop it. And in fact, the greenest nations today, by all rankings, the top 10 are nearly all highly secular societies, such as Sweden, Denmark, France, Norway, UK, et cetera, et cetera. So in conclusion, people often see religion as the source of morals, of values, of ethics, but secular humanism is rich with its own empathy and compassion, a desire to alleviate suffering, democracy, women's rights, sane, healthy sex education, climate care, rational policy making based on evidence and data, the scientific method, cosmopolitanism, and acceptance of existential mystery, and just setting that aside to focus on the here and now. These are the values that we live our lives by. They're not written on stone tablets, but they are our guiding principles. And I think the more we can express them and explain them and act upon them, the better the world will be. So I was asked to end with, what can you do? What I would say is, be out about your own secular identity in an affirming way. You don't need to put down religion. I may have slipped up a couple times, sorry. But really, actually, I think just by being clear about your own orientation when asked, when it comes up. It doesn't have to be in people's face, but when you're at work, or you're at an event, or you're in the community, you can say, I'm a secular humanist. What's that? I believe in the goodness, the good potential of humans to make the world a better place. That's where I hang my coat on that. That's where I have faith in humans to do the right thing when they, as best they can. And be clear about your humanist secular values and principles like the ones I've outlined. Number 2, pick one single secular humanist organization out there at least and join it or support it. If it's the Jefferson County Freethinkers, did I get the title right? Great. But there are national organizations. Secular Student Association is fantastic. It's cultivating the leaders of our youth. American Humanist Association, Freedom from Religion Foundation, which has a fantastic legal team to fight these our theo-fascists on the Supreme Court. Center for Inquiry. Find one of those and join. And it's not, and I'm telling you, actually those numbers matter, because when our politicians look at how many members are in the NRA or how many members are in the Evangelical Association of America, and then they look at how many members or how many Facebook members there are on American Humanist Association, it matters. And we need to show that our numbers are out there, which they are. Next, I would say, pick a single charity that's close to your heart, one cause, whatever it may be, and just make as small a donation as monthly as you can, whether it's $5 a month, whatever it is. And then fourth, get involved in local politics. If that means your school board, great. Your police board, great. Any kind of community boards. We need to get out there and be active if time permitting, energy permitting. But I think the more we are out about our values, and then the more we enact those organizationally and structurally, and the more we can get involved politically, the better. And with that, I will say thank you for listening to my talk. And I welcome questions. I hope I did okay time-wise, but good. All right.
Time for questions. Test.
I see one in the back.
Can you hear me? Okay. We have one in the back. There. So we'll take questions.
Yeah, what would you say to
And we have a couple of mics that'll roll around. He's here. He's doing it. Go ahead, please.
what would you say to people that incorporate what you were talking about into their moral system, the sort of the worship of the deity, or they refer upward, or they value subservience? Because as I understand it, that is part of people's moral system, their subjugation.
Right.
What would you say to them to convince them that that's not in fact moral?
Oh.
That what they need to do is, employ compassion, empathy,
Mm.
and, love to the fellow man as opposed to subservience to a deity or a higher power.
Thank you for that. So the first thing I would say is, For me, actions are more important than beliefs, right? Like, you can believe whatever you like, but at the end of the day, how you treat others is what I'm going to judge you on, right? And so I'd say to that, if that person you're talking about, whatever they say is going on in their head, if they say, I'm just doing this to obey a deity, and what I'm going to do in that obedience is, help out in a charitable cause, great. I'm all for that. And I don't have a debate with them, really. However, if it's that philosophical issue of, are you asking, like, what do I say to someone who says actually subservience to a higher power is fundamental as a moral condition? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like if you follow like Jonathan Haidt or somebody and they talk about the moral parameters that people obey or that they follow, one of them is subservience.
Right.
It's this idea that you are required to sort of do what the authority says.
Right. Yeah. So I would say that's an abdication of moral autonomy. That is the opposite of being moral. It's amoral. And the thing about Jonathan Haidt is he's saying this is what certain cultures say is moral. That's sort of a descriptive, like, that's not saying what is moral. It's just, hey, we got to recognize that in India it might be about purity. In this culture it might be about liberty. In this culture it might, So what I would say is, and this is what I do. Ready? It's a little bit long-winded, and I guess you can't do it if it's just in an elevator going to the 3rd floor. Following orders is an abdication of moral autonomy and moral reasoning. So this is what I say to my students. I'm a soldier, right? And I say, well, I'm going to obey commands. I'm going to obey orders. And if my commanding officer one day says to me, all right, tomorrow we're going into that village. They've suffered a lot. We're going to administer first aid, hand out food, provide medication. And I say, aye, aye, sir. And that next day I go into that village and I mend people's wounds and I comfort the sick, and great. And then the next day my commanding officer says, tomorrow we're going into a village full of, the enemy. We're going to kill everything that moves, man, woman, and child, and duck. And I say, aye, aye, sir. And I do that. And then the next day, I'm functionally amoral. You could say on the one day I did a good thing, and on the second day I was a murderer. But the notion of just, I'm just going to be subservient means I'm closing that box. I'm turning that light off, which makes me a moral autonomous being. What makes me a moral autonomous being is my ability to react to your suffering. And so that means if someone says, cause that person suffering, I'm not going to say, aye, aye, sir, whether it's my parent, my teacher, my principal, a police officer, the governor, or a god. I just think I thought that's what we learned from the Nuremberg trials, that Nazis were not allowed to say, I was just following orders. I thought we sort of kind of came to a human consensus that that's just not going to fly anymore. There are some commands that you are morally obligated to disobey. You may suffer for that, and we may all not have the courage to do that, We may not all be David Harris, willing to go to prison for a year instead of serving in a war that we disagree with. But, I think at the end of the day, subservience to a higher authority is an abdication, at least what I mean by moral. I mean, if being moral means following orders, then we just have different versions of what moral means, which can happen. So that's kind of where I'd go, and I would... I would try to. Right, I would try to. And I would try to find some consensus. I would say, do you think Nelson Mandela was a moral being? Do you think he was living in an unjust society? Do you think that he was being treated less than human by those in power, the white people in power? Yes, I do. So should he have followed those rules, or was he morally compelled to violate those rules and suffer the consequences? So I would say, in fact, I've heard of this guy, almost all moral prophets tell the same story. They go against the powers that be, because the powers that be are unjust, and they take a moral stand and they suffer for it. Look at Gandhi. Look at Rosa Parks. So I would just say to them, can you please tell me, what moral hero you're talking about whose morality was grounded in saying, aye, aye, yes, yes, sir, I'll do what I'm just following orders. But does it ever work? That's another story. But it's the best we can do, I think. And I think, again, if you talk to them about what is democracy, democracy is government by the consent of the governed. We are our own masters. That's what this country was founded on. So now you want to say being moral is just obeying a higher authority? Well, that's going to get us fascism.
We have another question?
Along those same lines, as you were saying this, I was confused because take, for example, people who refuse to get the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
So you've got the majority of the people who refuse to do that are conservative, religious, right-wing, and they're the ones that saying, I'm not going to do what you're telling me. And there's those of us that say, well, it's the right thing to do for ourselves and also for our fellow citizens because we're not going to die, we're not going to pass the germs along. But that seems to be opposite from what you're saying.
Okay, good question. Yeah, these things get convoluted and they fold back on each other. So I believe it was John Stuart Mill who talked about moral acts can be acts of commission or omission, if I remember from my intro to philosophy class. But I do remember the illustration, right? So on the one hand, we often talk about moral behavior as an action to be taken, right? Like you're hurt, you need help, you've been in a car accident, so I'm going to pull over and I'm going to help get you out of the car so you don't burn or whatnot. But I'm doing something. But imagine walking by a fountain and a 3-year-old child has fallen in and their parent has fallen asleep. You could just not do anything, but you're going to let that child drown. That's an act of omission, and that would be considered immoral. Like if you can help and you choose not to. So taking action or not taking action, it depends. It can be the moral choice and one cannot be the moral choice. So in the case of COVID and the COVID vaccine, you're absolutely right. The right-wingers and strong religious folks among us did not want to get vaccines, did not want to wear their masks, and they're saying no to that ruling. So there's a couple things I would say to that. Number one, I would say, I actually think they are within their rights, but that means they then have to accept the consequences of that. So if you're not going to take the vaccine, you can't go where other people might be vulnerable. You stay home. If you're not going to wear your mask, fine, but then you can't go where other people may be vulnerable who are immunocompromised. Stay home, right? So that I would be okay with that. But the idea is that in a pandemic, your neglect to take care of yourself isn't just harming you, it's harming the immunocompromised. So is that commission, omission? I'm not really sure, but you're actually causing harm to people by not adhering to certain health guidelines. And the other thing I would say is, if you're obeying the laws that have been established through a authority figure that is simply a ruler, that's different from obeying the laws of a consensus democracy. So for example, I can't go to Yosemite and spray paint, Phil was here on Half Dome. But that's not because the king will cut off my hands or the king it's because the citizens of the United States have deemed it a national park and we all pay our taxes and certain rules are there to protect it for everybody. So I guess what I would say is, are you violating the rules of a democratically elected consensus or are you violating the rules of a dictatorial, all-powerful master? Those are two different things. But at the end of the day, you are right. Someone could say, I'm not going to obey that because of my conscience. And I think they have that right, but they have to take the consequences. And they may be, when I mentioned David Harris was the student body president of Stanford. He didn't want to serve in Vietnam. He said, I'm not going. So it was a democratic war. It was a war being waged by a democracy, not a king, and he had to go to prison for a year. He accepted those consequences. So I think with the case of COVID, those who didn't get vaccinated and didn't wear masks were taking the immoral choice. They were causing suffering. They were causing suffering. That's how I define immoral. But were they being true to their own conscience? Sure. I would accept that.
Matthew, there's one up here.
Right at the front, okay.
A lot of people who don't know humanist or atheist presume that they are people of the head and not the heart, and that they're flat emotionally. And Paul Kurtz used the word eupraxiphy, and young people go on Match.com when they want to find someone, and they say not religious but spiritual. And I think that's their way of wanting a potential partner to acknowledge that they're emotionally fulfilled, and no one would accuse you of being, flat in terms of
Okay.
emotional zeal, but
And I get so
find-
many on Match, and I mean, I'm just like, no, just kidding. Okay, you should see. No, I've never been on Match.
Yeah. But I think in my interactions with other people, I've mentioned that I find as much zest and a sense of awe and reverence about nature that they do about the supernature, and rather than doing the hallelujahs and all of that, we can can be so emotionally fulfilled. I think like people like Carl Sagan and so many other scientists, it just seems to me that that's something we ought to emphasize more in terms of how we get a sense of excitement and resonance in life. Do you have anything to say about that?
I agree, ditto. Also impressed that you could so easily pronounce Paul Kurtz's word, which I always struggled with, Europraxis. I think you're right. I think there is that stereotype. Is it founded on anything realistic? Maybe, maybe not. Hard for me to say. I think there is some truth to the fact that religion tends to foster what Durkheim called collective effervescence. There's a certain kind of emotionality that can be tapped in religious ritual. There's a certain type of ecstasy that can be expressed in certain forms of religious worship, particularly when music is involved and singing. And so, I mean, there is something to that. You don't see it in a Danish Lutheran church, I'll tell you that much, which is pretty dry. But I would agree with you that for atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, the word that I often find best captures our approach is awe. I feel like there's a deep awe, and the difference is we experience awe at the majesty of nature, the amazingness of life, and we sort of just sit with that awe. We don't say, and that's evidence there are fairies. We don't sort of go to this like, aha. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was driving my daughter once to choir practice, and we were carpooling with a very Christian, young girl, and one day the sun was setting and the sky was afire in the clouds, and she said, "Look at it, God is showing off again." She was in fourth grade, and I turned around and I said, "Get out of the car." No, I said, "Oh yeah," but we just don't go there. And in fact, I would argue there's something more awe-inspiring by just sitting with mystery. It's funny when I've read the Book of Mormon, and I always invite Mormons. I don't anymore, it gets tiring, but I've often invited the Mormons in, and they tell you the plan of salvation. They sit down, they have these little car visuals, and they're like, "Let me tell you," and they start to tell you about God, Heavenly Father created the earth, and you're like, and it's almost like I get this like, wah, 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 like this is it? Like, this is what it's all about? There's this guy up there, he's 6'7", he lives on planet Kolob, and he's made of bone and flesh, but no blood, and he made us, and we're all his children, and it's kind of actually very uninspiring to me. I'm like, if this is meant to like blow me away, it's not working. So I think that awe is really an awe, and you see it in scientific inquiry, and you see it in creativity. Some of the most creative people often are non-believers, skeptics, because I think actually what religion often does is it puts in a box and it gives answers to things that maybe are beyond, that we can't even understand or conceive of. And so I think sitting with that mystery, appreciating it, enjoying the awe and wonder of life, I think is, and people often say that that's our disadvantage. People often say, well, how do you explain this? And we have to say, I don't know. And that just, oh, see, gotcha. No, you haven't proven anything. I'm simply acknowledging the mystery. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's true.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Judy Walker, and
Hi, Judy.
Hi, Phil. I'm a former board member of the Center for Inquiry, and so Phil and I met in 2015. And is that Gordon Gamm in the front who just asked that question? Okay. So I was going to ask a question. It's not a bone to pick. It's a nuanced view with respect to the awe and mystery gig.
Okay.
I'm really interested in that concept, but I worry about the rhetoric of living with the mystery, which you've been on for over a decade.
Yeah.
And the reason I am is not because there isn't any. It's that when we're focusing more on science, it means that, of course, it's fallibilistic. And of course, there are always going to be things that we can't either understand or know in a philosophical sense. We're bounded by our human problems and minds and all that. But when you say live with the mystery, I worry that that goes straight into what the Templeton Foundation has done with awe. And then you get into the problems with Datcher Keltner. You know, he's got this very well-known book on awe out right now, and it's all about focusing on what's spiritual and divine and this and that and the other. And I think that the mystery rhetoric, I'm a retired lawyer, forgive me, gets into the slippery slope aspect. And to me, the cohort of the spiritual but not religious of the nuns, as in NONES, belong to us. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining the rhetoric that does get to what Gordon was saying about how we can appreciate the sublime. But it's not that we're giving up, and it's not that we're saying there's so much mystery out there that we're going to cede that territory.
Right. I agree. Well said, well said. I think you should write that up. Good. Awesome. I hear you. I hear you. That's fantastic. And I agree. I don't know if you want my 2 cents other than to say, yeah, I mean, well, I guess my 2 cents would be sense number one. I guess rather than saying, wow, there's all this mystery and awe, I'm saying, and that needs to be set aside to address the problems that we can address in the here and now. In other words, I don't like to get hung up on that. That's what I find, like, you know, well, why are we here? How did it all begin? Why is there something instead of nothing? And I sort of say, like, really? Like, we can solve problems in the here and now, so let's, like, let that mystery sit and focus on what we can know. But my second sense is I agree with you that that could be seen as a kind of lazy abdication of the scientific inquiry, and it could be seen as, hey, that doesn't, just because we don't know something now does not mean we may not understand it in the future. That's the story of science. We make progress, and 300 years ago, there may have been a mystery that we have now solved. So I appreciate that we want to stay proactive about, you know, what we may or may not understand at this point, and not just simply leave that to the Templeton folks. So I agree with you. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So a lot of times when I'm talking with somebody that's a believer and they're saying absurd things, and it's, how do you keep from offending them? Because it seems so easy to do.
Man, good question. I guess it depends if it's my mother-in-law or my neighbor. If it's the former, I try my best not to offend because she's a wonderful woman and we're a family. And if it's my neighbor, I'm like, you know, that's so hard. It is really hard. And, you know, it's hard because I agree with you. I don't know how to say this in a polite way. I think the beliefs of every religion I've ever studied are manifestly absurd. It's not that I just like, well, I don't quite agree with, this hasn't been shown to be, it's like, it's nuts to me, right? At face value, just at face value. You're saying this? Like what? So yeah, it's impossible to express that and not come off as pompous, as an asshole, as, you know, and making someone be offended. So honestly, 2 things. I actually don't get into it too much with religious believers. I just don't find it fruitful. I feel like it raises everybody's blood pressure. And as somebody once said, if someone believes something that's irrational, I don't know that rational argument is going to make a difference. I mean, if they're going to accept this premise, I mean, I had a student come in who started talking about devils and demons, and it's just like, I don't know, you know, you might as well tell me you think there are leprechauns living in your pocket. Like, I don't know how we're supposed to have a kind of, we're not sharing the same reality. So we can't really draw on the same logic, the same facts, because you think there are leprechauns in your wallet or demons or whatever. So what do I do, though, if I have to? I try to do this. First, is there something we can both agree on? Some moral principle or some article of logic or some fact about the world, and try to build from there. And I try to emphasize what we do share. Some of the first things I'll say to like a real strong believer, and I'll say, you know what, Joe? You and I, we probably agree on most things. We probably agree that you ought to be a good person, you ought to be kind, you ought to be honest, we care about children. I try to build that foundation and say, like, our disagreements are probably not as stark as they seem. And then I try to get to the burden of proof is on you. You're making the claim. Do you have any evidence? Sorry, I need evidence. And I just try not to, but I'll end by saying, I don't, as my students can tell you, I don't do a very good job. I'm just not good at not being offensive. I think I'm really offensive, and it's tough. I mean, I'll tell you one story. I was teaching at Pitzer, at the Claremont colleges, and I was teaching a sociology of religion class. And sociology of religion is awesome because it's looking at religion as a social phenomena. It's as just another aspect, another institution out there in the world. And it's not theology, it's not church history, it's looking at religion as a social reality. And so you get to talk about it like a social reality, how it's socially constructed, and so on and so forth. So I was giving a lecture on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is an amazing example because unlike other world religions, it started here not that long ago in English. Like, you can just, the documents are there, the founding sources are there, the affidavits, we know who started it, how they started, who the first converts were, how they, we know who the first apostates were. We have so much rich data. So I was simply giving a fact-based lecture on Joseph Smith and the con schemes he used, how he was arrested, how he fled, how he went to Palmyra, and I just went through it. And it's great information. You can watch it on South Park if you need to. It's really riveting. So I thought it was and I had all my sources, and I mean, this was as robust. I could back every assertion up with historical evidence. And then the next day, a student from that class came to my office, and she said, within 5 minutes, she was crying, and she said, I'm LDS. I've never heard any of that, and I was deeply offended. And I felt bad. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. Do you want to see my sources? Like, I don't know. I don't know what to do here. And she transferred. She left. So, went to BYU or whatever. So I just don't know what, I just feel like, and I will say, I value intellectual integrity. I want a believer to be as frank with me, and I try to treat them the way I would treat them, so I'm going to be honest about what I believe, and I'm going to try not to make ad hominem attacks. I'm going to try not to put them down, put their family down, but at the end of the day, I'm going to say your beliefs don't hold water to me, and they may help you get through the night, but I think they're problematic, and here's why. And you'll have to invite me back next year to go through that list.
Real quick, I think I can kind of answer your question. And you brought up talking to missionaries, and I don't know how many missionaries from the Mormon Church you have had knock on your door. But when I have the missionaries knock on my door, I invite them in as a humanist. Now, I have credibility that many of you don't, which you can ask me about later. But I have found that speaking to the young missionaries, real quickly, a month ago, they came to my door, young man, just been here. He was from France. He hardly spoke English. The other was from Draper, Utah. I talked to them not about their religion. I talked to them about, well, why are you here? Where did you come from? You went to your training mission. How long are you going to be here? What are you going to do afterwards? And then I start talking to them about thinking about where they're going from where they're at, what kind of schooling they're going to have, to think about the people that they meet on the way that disagree with them but have a lot of good things to say about their education, what they'll learn from it, and the differences, and they always like to come back.
Nice. Good job. And they don't leave in tears.
Yeah, do you know of a sociological or socioeconomic system that tends to bend society towards this compassion and empathy you're talking about and away from the authoritarianism? Is there one in particular that really stands out, a system that you're aware of?
To me, it's social democracy or welfare capitalism. So it's taking the best of capitalism and the best of socialism and welding them together. So it's a system of democracy. So first of all, it has to be government by the consent of the governed. It takes the best of capitalism, competition, innovation, risk, profit motive, and it welds that with a basic existential social security for everyone. So everyone has access to housing, healthcare, food, and education. And it doesn't have to be the same, but just a sort of basic minimum. And there can always be some inequality in between. But I've lived it. I lived in Scandinavia for 2 years. I've seen what they have there. It was enacted non-violently, no violent revolution. Democracy is alive and well. Human rights are alive and well. But what they have is a situation where the rich aren't too rich and the poor aren't too poor. No one has, some people may have too much, but no one doesn't have enough. And to me, that's a sort of sane approach to society. And what happens is you see crime rates go down, despair, hostilities, tribalisms. It's not utopia. I take that back. There is some tribalism that emerges. There are problems. There is depression. So I don't mean to say it's like, the Wizard of Oz land or whatever. But if you look at the most successful societies today, and by successful, I mean they have the best healthcare, the best education systems, the best elder care, the best disability rights, the best women's rights, almost all of them are social welfare capitalist democracies that are not, unbridled capitalism, but they're certainly not communist dictatorships. So to me, that model of democracy and social welfare coupled with the best of capitalism, sorry, kids, I don't know, my kids are Bernie, I like Bernie, but to me, I think that's proven the most effective. That's what I always say to my kids. They're always talking about, well, what about socialism? What about this and capitalism? I'm like, well, just look at what works. Yes, it's good to have these ideological debates, but let's look at what works. What societies today are the most peaceful, the most egalitarian, the most humane? I mean, that's the thing that struck me so much about living in Scandinavia, how it's very humane. It was said here, atheists are often seen of not having a heart. When I live there, the degree to which they care for the people that have disabilities, the people that have health crises, the people that have, when my wife had a stroke, I'm a dean of a college. I have excellent health insurance. When my wife had a stroke, we were shit out of luck. You know what I'm saying? And that's just not the case in the Scandinavian nations. No one would be left in the lurch and have to go to GoFundMe for a stroke that you have no fault in experiencing. So that's my favorite system. I'm open to alternatives. Yeah.
I think you answered part of my question. You're obviously an optimist about people, and that's how you operate, and that's great. I wonder over time if we as a human species have really learned that much. We've learned a lot of new facts and things about how nature works, but how to get along. We just keep making weapons that are farther from the people that we're trying to get rid of. Yeah. What do you say to that part of the human experience?
Yeah, Martin Luther King, what he said, we've learned to swim the seas, we've learned to fly the skies, but we haven't learned to live and walk as brothers and sisters. So I would say, I think my optimism is a bit perhaps silly. It's just the way I'm wired. I don't know if it's necessarily empirically supported, but this is what I would say. For the societies that we have data over time, and Steven Pinker writes a lot about this, Michael Shermer writes a lot about this, and others, I do believe that day-to-day violence against each other has decreased hugely in the last 500 years, significantly. Just violence, interpersonal violence in Amsterdam, in London, in New York. So we are actually, in day-to-day life, much more peaceful with each other than we've ever been. expanding circle. So Peter Singer talks about we were originally hunters and gatherers. We evolved as primate hunter and gatherer tribes. We developed strong in-group favoritism and out-group suspicion and hostility that is hardwired in our bioevolutionary makeup. And so for a long time it was just our side of the river, and we got to kill them because they're a threat. And then it was, our side of the valley versus them. But that circle of who is us versus them has grown. It kind of grew linguistically. So I guess if you say déjà vu and I say déjà vu, I guess we're on the same team. And then, of course, racial constructions come into play, which thwart. Nationalism comes into play, which thwarts. So there are all these divisions that keep that us versus them alive in us. But I think the circle of those of us who see us as a common humanity has grown over the millennia, I think. So so I sort of see our history as like, we get better and better, awful genocide. We get better and better, horrible warfare. So I don't see it as like, we're just this glorious, but I do see the overall trajectory as we are seeing more and more of our common humanity. We slip back into that tribalism every now and then, and when we do, it gets very ugly. Throw some nuclear bombs in there, it gets deadly. But I guess I think that the data shows that most of us, most of the time, want to treat others well, but there's always those exceptions, and tribalism is just kind of right under the skin and always ready to be tapped. So when Trump says build the wall, it's actually tapping into a bioevolutionary aspect of ourselves of like us versus them. Us versus them. They're invading. Who's they? That other small hunter and gatherer tribe from 2 million years ago. That's them. And immigrants are taking our jobs. Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group. These just tap into, the Jews will not replace us. This just taps into that fundamental, is it racism? I think it's a sort of tribal, ethnocentric aspect to it. So yes, that's always there. And we may be entering another bad era. But I generally think we continue to improve, but I could be wrong, and it is scary. I was going to say one more thing that gives me hope. I guess I think with our technology, that may be the end of us. It's true that those bad parts of us, those dark angels of our nature or whatever, are more potent today, just because we have the technological means to create more damage and destruction. So, the Trumpers, the Bolsonaros, the Putins, they just seem to, the Assads, the Netanyahus, like they just seem to be able to do more damage than in the past. But I am an optimist. Maybe it's just because I just couldn't live any other way. If I just, if I thought we were doomed, it would just be hard for me to get out of bed. So that's the best I can offer.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
My name's Josh. Came up from Colorado Springs. I'm a recovering Mormon.
Okay. Mazel tov.
Did the whole BYU, served a mission in Brazil, so I appreciate the banter here. And
okay.
Especially Amber's story in your book as well.
Okay.
That was really great. I know your book as well as Greg Epstein's book, Good with How God, addresses community for humanists, atheists, and agnostics, and it's challenging. I mean, I was speaking here to a friend about being down in the Springs, which is very right-wing. It's challenging to find community, and after losing my blueprint for life in Mormonism, finding community has been difficult. Is there any new or updated advice coming out to bring us together and build community?
Thanks for sharing, and thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for just being open and about your journey and in a way being vulnerable, so I appreciate that. And what I've noticed, I've interviewed hundreds of secular folks, many who were religious and at some point left that. Some I've also interviewed a lot of people who were just raised without religion, and those are interesting. But what I have found is, it's very different depending on what tradition you came from. Like people raised in a Roman Catholic or Irish Catholic often have certain experiences that are different from what Orthodox Jews may have had. And I would say the LDS folks, what I understand about the LDS community is so embedded, right? You already know this, but maybe others in the audience don't know this, but from my understanding, it's not church just on Sundays. You have like family night, which I believe is maybe one night a week. At a certain point in school, you go to Mormon class before regular school. I forget what it's called, for an hour or something, like at 6 in the morning. There are weekly events throughout the week. There are youth events and young women events and young boy events. Like, it is a total cosmos. And so to experience that, and it can actually be incredibly fulfilling. Like, I have some some of my best friends are Mormon. No, I have some friends who are active Mormons. Patrick Mason is a brilliant guy and a warm, sweet man. And then I have some ex-Mormon friends. And one of my ex-Mormon friends loved it. He just also loved looking at the JCPenney catalog of men in tight white underwear. So he was gay, and that was a part of his identity. He went to BYU, met other gay men, and he was rejected by his family and his religion for being gay. He didn't reject Mormonism. He loved it. He loved Joseph Smith. He loved the words of wisdom. He loved the scriptures. He loved the community. And he said to me, I would still be Mormon right now if I wasn't gay. Even if I would be, but they don't accept me. They've kicked me out, and I'm not allowed to have my nephew sit on my lap, at a family gathering or whatnot. So I would say you have a particularly tough journey there, as opposed to someone who was raised in a lay liberal Protestant, congregation. So that's my long-winded way of not answering your question. I'll get to it now. I'll not answer it this way too. It's also nice to be Jewish because it's an ethnicity as well as a religion, or it's an ethno-religion. So I get to feel that sense of community, and I don't have to believe anything. And not only do I not have to believe it, but no one expects me to believe it. Like, no Jews I know, well, I shouldn't say no, but the vast majority of Jews I know aren't believing in the religion. They just celebrate certain holidays. It's an ethnic identity, and so on and so forth. But I think for certain group, being an ex-Jehovah's Witness is very different from being an ex-Mormon, being, a more fundamentalist or a more all-embracing. So what I would say is, what are your options for community? Number one, obviously finding other former LDS folks to be with, hang out with, share war stories with, and just go bowling with, right? Another option would be secular community, humanist groups, things like Secular Hub. And then I think, I personally, I don't know if this is going to go well over with the crowd, but I love the UUs. If I really needed that type of experience, now some UU congregations are a bit more religious and spiritual, some are a bit more atheistic and humanistic, some have an atheist subgroup within their congregation, and I feel like the UUs are a fantastic, and if not the UUs, silent friends, man. Go to the silent Quaker meeting. You're not going to hear anybody talk about, well, shouldn't say you're not, it depends on the meeting. But the end of the day, there is no, I believe, I could be wrong, there is no automatic secular alternative to what Americans can get from a religious community. Because in a religious community, for example, the connection between generations, where else can you get that, right? That connecting to descendants and ancestors, to be connecting with one generation, grandparents, parents, and grandkids, knowing that what the grandparent went through, the grandchild is going to go through, and their granddaughter is going to go through one day. That's a strong chain of memory. And so, for example, I can play soccer every Sunday morning, which I do, and experience a strong sense of community, but that's not connecting me to my ancestors or my descendants, right? I can get involved in a charitable organization, but I'm not getting all the other things that a religious community provides. Music, coming-of-age rituals during the life cycle. So I think there's a kind of one-stop shop that you get from religious communities. Life cycle rituals, charitable options, music, inspiring sermons, boring prayers, whatever. You get it all, and I think you can get each piece of those somewhere else. But I don't know if you can get the whole package. And again, in Denmark, nobody goes to church, but it's a very homogenous society. They all are eating the same cereal at the same time. They wear the same boots. They have the same last name. They speak the same impronounceable language. And there's this sense of togetherness that they get. I've been to Vietnam. I've interviewed secular people in Vietnam. they don't think, that question, like, how will I get community without religion, doesn't exist in Vietnamese society. It's a particularly American phenomena. We're a diverse country, ethnically, racially, linguistically, religiously, class, so we move around a lot for jobs or school or divorce. So we have this particular problem of community that isn't universal, isn't global, and is a kind of unique phenomena. Whether the secular community can rise to that challenge and create ritual, music, and intergenerational bonding, the optimist in me says yes, but we'll see. I don't know the answer, so good luck on your journey.
We'll call that the last
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, we're going to call that the last question. I'm sure you guys still have other questions for Phil. Phil is going to be here at the reception, and we invite you to stay if you have the time. So everybody give Phil a great hand. Thank you very much. And we invite you all to come and enjoy our reception. Thank you.